So thanks a lot. It's great as ever to be here for the Happy Reader Book Club. I hope you know the magazine. Every 6 months we print a new edition. Every issue of the magazine is inspired by a single classic work of literature. And the current issue is in the orbit of a book called Frankenstein. So very happy to welcome our two panelists for this club. Joel Levy is a journalist and an author, a very prolific one who's written widely and deeply on the history of science and topics surrounding the subject of science. Topically for tonight, he is the author of a book entitled Frankenstein and the Birth of Science, which delves into this moment that Mary Shelley inhabited, which sort of, I guess, was the dawn of something we call science and the death of something we used to call alchemy. We'll get onto more of that later. And then Kate Finnegan, an erudite journalist, used to work at the, formerly of the Telegraph, now a freelancer, roaming through lots of the most prestigious titles of our time, such as the Financial Times, Vogue, The Observer, things like that. Also an avid reader who has kindly looked at Frankenstein again for the first time in 20 years, is it?
Yes, possibly slightly more, but I'll say 20, yeah.
So Frankenstein to me is perhaps more than anything else a book about the dangers of procrastination. And I wanted to ask, who here has read the book? And who here has read the book recently for the purposes of the book club? Oh, so it's not so bad. Who's heard of the book?
Everybody.
So, I mean, I guess we should start at the beginning, which isn't what a lot of people expect. Well, like the whole book, it's not what a lot of people expect. We all think it's going to be. I think probably the Boris Karloff movie from the early 20th century is more key in terms of what image we have in our heads when we think of Frankenstein. It's a bolt-necked, square-headed, mute, but strangely cute beast. And actually, the book is quite different to that. So I'll read the first paragraph just because it's so startlingly not what people expect after 200 years. So it's a letter to Mrs. Saville, England, from St. Petersburg, December the 11th, 17 dash. You will rejoice to hear that no disaster has accompanied the commencement of an enterprise which you have regarded with such evil forebodings. I arrived here yesterday, and my first task is to assure my dear sister of my welfare and increasing confidence in the success of my undertaking. I am already far north of London. So it starts off as a kind of Arctic adventure. A man named Walton is on a ship somewhere in the Arctic seas, and he's updating his sister from afar about how that's going. And I mean, well, actually, I was looking at some Goodreads reviews before I came here, and it's got quite good reviews on Goodreads. The most popular rating was 4 stars. 34% of people gave it 4 stars from the million ratings it had on Goodreads. 29% gave it 5 stars, and only 3% gave it 1 star. But one of those reviews complains about this Arctic context and the sort of nonsense that you have to get through before you get to the actual story about the monster. And that review said, an upper crust guy sails off to the Arctic to make discoveries, and to pass the time he writes to his sister. Supposedly, he's been sailing around on whaling ships for several years, and he's been proven an invaluable resource by other captains. I mean,
supposedly.
Yeah, she hated this book. She thought it was a waste of time. But still, it's interesting. And I'm wondering, I mean, lots of novels from those days had this strange Russian doll effect. I mean, and what we learn is that Walton, the guy who's writing the letters, comes across Dr. Frankenstein, because Frankenstein's the doctor, not the monster. We have to say that every time. And he comes across this guy, and he's floating adrift in the Arctic Sea, and he has a story to tell. And the novel, the story of the Doctor and his monster, well, that's contained in this presumably humongous letter from Walton to his sister. And then within that you have this Russian doll, this stacked effect of stories. So it's Dr. Frankenstein's story, eventually it's the monster's story, eventually in the monster's story there's another story, and then it kind of goes back out again. It's kind of polar sandwich. I wanted to ask, I mean, you've kind of written about this context.
Yeah,
yeah.
There's a lot to say about the polar exploration of polar science. I mean, I have a little bit of sympathy with your one-star reviewer, because most people who come to the novel, what did they come for? They came for the monster. So there is, a bit of, stuff going on before that, which if you just know it from the films or popular culture, you're not expecting. So there is at a remove. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people, I mean, obviously it's a novel of its time, and probably a lot of people think it's going to be Sherlock Holmes or Stephen King or something, and then find they're reading early 19th century fiction. So there's probably, I'm surprised there weren't more one-star reviews. But yeah, so yes, at the beginning, in the letter, Walton very quickly, in the space of a few paragraphs, gets from St. Petersburg to near the pole, and he talks about what he's doing and why he's exploring. And so it's something I write about in my book, because actually it was remarkably topical at the time. Polar exploration was like absolutely to the minute. She started writing in 1816 and it was published right at the beginning of 1818, and that was right in the midst of a sort of particularly torrid period of polar exploration. And shortly after the novel was published, an expedition did go to the polar regions to explore, and met with quite a similar fate to Walton's in the book. In the book, he doesn't get very far because he's actually not a very good explorer. He's slightly incompetent, and there is some theorizing from analysts and critics that this is a kind of satire by Shelley, and that she was writing about. I mean, although in the character himself is superficially sympathetic, but he is very much a mirror of the Frankenstein character. Yeah. They're both quite hubristic.
He's quite annoying, I
exactly.
think.
I mean,
he's just so self-important.
He's self-involved, and he's a bit of an idiot, and he actually causes some of his crew die, and eventually the rest of them start complaining so much that they're all going to die because the ice is closing in and they can't get any further, and they beg him to turn around. And unlike Frankenstein, who of course doesn't stop and continues, past the point of no return, Walton actually decides that discretion is the better part of valour, and turns around with his tail between his legs. So
otherwise we wouldn't have got the book.
Well, there you go. Exactly. Otherwise, how would the letter have got home? Indeed. So there is some theory that Shelley was being quite that she was writing a bit of a satire, and she was satirising the kind of over ambitious polar explorers and the polar science of the day, and all the and the whole imperial project of this sort of machismo of going out to explore, to penetrate the undiscovered bits of the world, and claim them for empire and for Britain, without any regard to to common sense or people's lives, or God forbid, people who live there or anything like that. So she's gesturing, or at least getting towards a whole load of quite complicated themes about imperial ambition and exploration and stuff. I mean, more specifically, there's quite a lot of stuff about polar science, and Walton says, at the beginning, he explains to his sister why he's venturing to the far north is to make discoveries in magnetic science, because at the time, it had been believed for hundreds of years that the reason that compasses point to the north is because there's a giant mountain of magnetic lodestone actually at the North Pole. But when mariners started to venture quite far north, they discovered that their magnets didn't point to true north, they pointed slightly off, because actually magnetic north is not the same as true north. And also because there are quite a lot of local variations and stuff, that when you get near the pole, your compass isn't very useful, it doesn't really work. So there's a lot of challenges for navigation back then. And so there were discoveries to be made, perhaps, that would benefit people. But he specifically says that what he thinks is going to happen when he gets through the pack ice is he will find the open sea beyond, because there was a very prevalent theory at the time that the polar seas were open seas, that they weren't ice, that there was only ice to a certain point, and that if you got past that, there would be open sea. And in fact, in ancient times, there'd been legends of this legendary place called Hyperborea, the land beyond the north winds, which was supposed to be a land of a kind of Atlantis-type place where people lived almost forever and they didn't have disease or war, and they lived in these beautiful balmy conditions. And so somehow if you broke through, it'd be like you know,
Finding
journeying to the centre of the
paradise.
earth or something. You'd get there and you'd find this beautiful semi-tropical paradise.
Wasn't there? There's quite a lot of supernatural hokum pokum around the North Pole. I seem to, because we had in issue 4 of the Happy Reader, we featured a book called The Purple Cloud by a writer called M.P. Shield, and it's from about 100 years after Frankenstein, obviously quite influenced by Shelley's other novel, The Last Man, because it's about another Last Man kind of story. But the beginning of that book involves the hero or anti-hero also ploughing up to the North Pole, and he actually makes it. And by making it to the North Pole, he triggers Armageddon, essentially, the apocalypse. The Earth has its revenge on humanity and spews cyanide gas out of these volcanoes in the South Seas and kills everyone on Earth apart from him.
Wow.
But that was something that people really thought might happen. If you ever got there, it would kind of flip a switch and that would be it for people. Anyway.
So it was like the ultimate frontier, terrifying stuff
Yeah.
of nightmares, possibly.
Yeah, and sort of Frankensteinian, obviously the symbol of hubris as well.
I mean, obviously, a lot of the expeditions that went up there did meet quite horrific ends, and in fact, you know, obviously the Franklin expedition was pretty terrible, and then they even, isn't there a film out now or a TV series about the, you know, the terrible things that happened, and they went mad, they ended up eating each other. That's the kind of thing that used to happen. It was a bit de rigueur for your Northern Polar expedition, that you would like disappear, never be seen again, or you'd go mad and you'd end up eating each other, whatever. So expeditions to the North Pole were freighted with a lot of danger, and obviously you've got this crazy landscape, the amazing vistas of ice, the giant icebergs, the northern lights. It's a very Gothic place. So obviously appealed to the Gothic imagination.
And then this worn-out doctor gets washed up onto the.
Well, yeah, before they meet
But,
him,
yeah.
they see a monstrous figure flying past them on a sledge.
There are quite a lot of amazing coincidences, aren't there, in Frankenstein, where
Yeah.
they're in the middle of nowhere and all the protagonists meet. It's yeah,
It's worse than Dallas.
yeah.
So 80s reference there. I don't understand. So then the story properly starts, and we hear the story of Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who grew up in a well-to-do family in sort of the central Europe near Lake Geneva, Switzerland. We hear his family background. I won't go into that too much. Eventually, he goes to university in Ingolstadt, a small city, and by tinkering with the principles he's learned by reading old alchemy books as well as new science books, he eventually cracks the secret of life, makes a person. That person comes
Well,
to
what's
life.
important is before he gets to university, he's been a bit self-educated and he's read lots of stuff about mystics and alchemists and stuff. And then when he gets to university, he's confronted with these two different professors who are both faces of the new science, especially the new chemistry, but they have very different attitudes to the old alchemy. One of them is
The first one dismisses him.
yeah,
doesn't
and
he?
he's magisterial. He's like every instant you have wasted on these ancient texts has been utterly wasted, which is quite good. That's what I'd be like if I was a teacher. But the other one is much more the groovy and is like, yeah, you know, there's a lot of truth in these, but you know, they were only grasping at what the amazing things we can now do, and he actually is a figure that's drawn very much from her experience of English scientists around that time, which we'll probably talk about later. But she actually puts in his mouth a speech that probably comes almost verbatim from Humphrey Davy, who was a contemporary scientist.
Because he used to go to her family
Yeah,
home.
he was a family friend. He was a friend of her father's, and she'd been to his lectures at the Royal Institution,
Yeah.
which she might get onto later. So that sets it up nicely, because he's immediately confronted with these two people who give him and the reader a bit of a crash course in the old sort of alchemy and the new science as well, to set up the context of his researches.
Yeah, Kate, I wanted to ask, Because you read it, wasn't undergrad or as
as an undergrad,
right,
yeah.
so at university, and
Yeah.
coming back to it again, was it completely different to how you remembered it? Or
I didn't
what was-
remember anything about
Yeah.
the North Pole at all, so that was
Right.
kind of a shock. And I didn't remember him being I didn't remember that there was this quite idiotic character. That's how I see him anyway. And I did feel like you have to plough through it a bit. Like, come on, get on with it. But it was a real discovery coming back to it, and I'd also forgotten how unrelentingly sort of miserable it is as well. It just doesn't let up. The kind of arduous journey that the captain's on it's such hard work, isn't it? Everything about him is kind of laboured, I felt. And then Frankenstein's work is, for a moment, kind of exciting and joyous, but as soon as he creates the monster, then it's just downhill for everybody. And everybody there is, well, monster and creator are both equally miserable and reflecting each other's misery in a really interesting way. I kind of wanted it to end because I just wanted everybody to stop feeling this agony. And I started at one point counting the number of times that the word misery or miserable was written, and I stopped because it's a couple of times or 3 times on almost every page.
But he kind of brings on himself, Victor Frankenstein. He really drives me mad. Like, he keeps forgetting what he's supposed to be doing, which is defeating this monster, and he just suddenly decides he's on a backpacking trip at some point, and he's the monster. Oh, I haven't seen the monster for a while, isn't it?
But let's go
he
and
must
look
have
at a
forgotten about me. Yeah, let's go and look around Scotland for 2 months.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that Ireland was in it as well, and yeah.
So the book's a big, the book has, I mean, it's incredible. It's like, she wrote this book and it's become larger than life. It's so much part of our culture. The word Frankenstein is such a heavy word and everyone knows what it means. Even if you've never read the book or seen any of the films, you kind of just pick it up by a kind of cultural osmosis. And then the story surrounding the writing of the book has its own legend. Maybe not quite as well known, so I'll recount it quickly, but it's a legend about a legend. So it was published just over 200 years ago in 1818, but it was written in 1816 when an 18-year-old Mary Shelley, so she was 18 when she wrote it, which just blows my mind. I mean, nobody here is ever going to read anything I wrote when I was 18. And so it was her and her husband, Percy Shelley, were essentially on holiday, staying in the house of the poet Byron. And somewhere in Indonesia, a volcano had erupted, and that had played havoc with the weather that year, and it meant that there was no sun. It was called the year without a summer. And so they were left to get on with their own indoor activities. And one day Byron suggested we will all write a ghost story. We're going to have a competition to see who can write the best ghost story. And that's what created the book. Amazingly,
they had been reading German ghost stories to each other, which is quite interesting because it raises the possibility they might have been reading someone like Hoffman or something which has bearing on the story, on Frankenstein, story of Frankenstein. But anyway, sorry.
And amazingly, I was going to say, the same time that Frankenstein was written, a doctor called John Polidori, who was also there and also responded to the challenge, wrote the first vampire story and created the vampire. Week. So, I mean, how mad is that? Most short story competitions that magazines run these days don't have anything.
That's the success rate.
But, I mean, we were discussing it kind of by email, Kate, before we got here, about how these themes of abandonment and isolation and the misery of the book perhaps finds its source in the misery of Mary's own life.
Well, I wonder, yes. When you read about what she has gone through in the year before she writes the book and during the writing of the book, then it's quite monumentally awful. Well, she meets Shelley, and Shelley is married to somebody else who is pregnant when they elope, and her father, who she adores, from my understanding, rejects her, casts her out, cuts her off, and she has no mother. Her mother died, Mary Wollstonecraft died when she was only 13 days old, so she didn't know her mother. She had a very close relationship with her father. I think he seems quite hard, quite harsh, but she...
Well, but see, you don't want to be anachronistic. I mean, I'm not excusing his behaviour, but presumably there's a whole honour thing going on there, and it would have brought shame on the family name, I don't know, stuff like that.
But given that he was quite a liberal...
Well, yeah, but see, by that time, of course, he'd got quite old and had sold out a lot of his liberal principles, I think. I think
but he'd
probably
made
got
his
a lot
name
more conservative by then.
Yeah, and yeah, people can be liberal about their own lives, but not necessarily their children's or their offspring. Yeah. That seems to have been the case. But if she was in isolation, I suppose, from her family, she'd been surely suffering a sense of rejection. I think her first child had also died, and they were in a different country. So I just I sense a kind of feeling of isolation. She's writing it in a circumstance of isolation, and then during the writing of it, Shelley, her half sister, commits suicide. Shelley's wife commits suicide by throwing herself in the Serpentine when she's pregnant. So it's grim. The stuff that's going on is really grim and kind of gothic in its own way. And
I mean, and obviously the whole book is seething with these undercurrents of tragedy and life trauma, because obviously in the book, Frankenstein effectively parents or engenders this being, but then rejects it.
Yes, exactly.
And of course she was, her mother died in childbirth, and then now her father's rejected her as well. So there's so much,
I have a relevant Goodreads 1-star quote here.
Okay.
This is just a book about the worst parent ever.
Yeah.
Victor goes off and creates his monster, and then once he's finished, decides, oh no, it's too ugly and scary, and runs off.
Yeah. Well,
that person is quite right.
That's a pretty good synopsis.
Yeah. He never seems to feel. Well, he has occasional feelings of guilt.
Yeah.
But then he dismisses
he forgives
them.
himself quite easily.
Yes, yeah. He seems more concerned about the destruction that the monster is going to pull down on the rest of humanity, rather than his kind of taking responsibility for his part in the creation, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, he forgives himself. I mean, he's not he's not a great guy, ultimately, because...
He's not very paternal, isn't he?
No, I mean, he does this colossal cock up, and then he refuses to take responsibility for it, and this terrible transgression of refusing to parent this thing that he's created is what unleashes all this. I mean, it was hubristic to create it in the first place, but then he's rejected it as well. So there's like double nemesis.
We have an audience contribution coming in from Sam.
Yeah, it's so interesting listening to you guys talk about it, because I guess coming in now, none of you have been gushing about the book and the quality of it, and it's just the one thing that I can't reconcile is the fact that this is so well known and it's played such a huge part in culture from when it was written. Why? Like, I don't understand why, when it's such a miserable book, it's such a chore to get.
But it's miserable in a kind of awesome way, though, isn't it?
It's a beautifully written book. If I didn't say that, I thought it went without saying. It's incredible. I mean,
she did really well.
I mean, so the two protagonists we talked about already, Walton and Frankenstein, are not sympathetic. The monster is amazingly sympathetic for a terrible deranged killer.
The concept is like,
and the reason it's
biblical, isn't it?
It's totally transcended itself anyway. So that's why it's so famous, because it became this immediate, newly created, perfect myth, a wonderful archetype for all sorts of really important concerns then, and even more now about science. And
two archetypes, in fact, because the mad scientist is also, you can't escape the mad scientist. It's everywhere, and it's an endlessly extendable metaphor, I think. I mean, actually, we had a little book club before I started working on the issue, just to give me some ideas for what to put in the issue. And issues are available here if you don't have one. And I asked the table who they identified with more, the monster or the doctor. So maybe I can take a straw poll
Oh, yeah, that's
here.
a good idea.
Who identifies with the Doctor more than the monster? 2. Who identifies
3.
with the monster more than the Doctor?
Probably.
7. I mean, sorry, 8. 9. And then lots of abstentions. That's how I'm going to read that. It's like Brexit, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that seems to bear out quite a lot, which is amazing given that the monster does do some pretty awful stuff.
But the monster makes an effort. I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
Frankenstein makes no effort. The
But he's
monster achieves
sympathetic.
such.
I mean, he's articulate, he's intelligent, he's very spiritual.
The monster.
The monster.
Yeah, and he learns that. He learns how to be those things.
And he has positive instincts from the off. I mean, one of the first things he tries to do is rescue a woman from drowning.
Yeah,
but he doesn't.
No
and
thanks
then
for
he's
that.
trying to revive her, but then of course he gets accused of killing her and gets driven off.
Well, what
so-
strikes me, because he's so articulate. I mean,
Yeah.
the Boris Karloff, the famous Boris Karloff movie, the Hammer. Is it Hammer Horror? Does it count as that? It's within that sort of.
No,
not.
Universal.
Yeah, I know it's not.
James Whale.
Sorry, can we cut that from the video? But yeah, anyway, the Karloff movie, everyone knows that movie if you haven't seen it. He doesn't say a word, he's completely mute. He doesn't say anything, and he just kind of makes noises occasionally, and it's sort of strange. But in the book, I mean, he'd be the ideal panelist here in a way, better than any of us, kind of talking about Frankenstein for obvious reasons,
the
but also
most
because he's so
rational,
well-spoken.
learned monster.
But there's this thing, isn't there? Every time somebody, and that's tested to the limit when there's a scene, if you haven't read it, where he's hiding out in a barn, kind of, and this is where he learns to read and to speak, because there's a family living in the in the house, and he can see in, and he can overhear them, and so he stays there for ages, and eventually he thinks, I'm going to throw myself on their mercy, and maybe they'll take me in because I'm intelligent, I've got a lot of love to give, and also the old man is blind, so he can't see me, and so I'll wait till everyone else is out, and I'll go and see the old man, and he does this, and the old man's actually quite
He's starting
sympathetic.
to respond, isn't he?
Yeah. But as soon as the rest of the family comes back and sets eyes on him, there's no possibility for him to be accepted, and that happens over and over again, and it's the same response that the Doctor has the second he sees him. It's like, and there are times when the Doctor says, I'm almost feeling like I can maybe sympathise with this monster, but it looks so horrible.
Yeah, I mean, it's an
you know.
important theme. The monster, she writes the monster that the way he's been made makes him, I mean, it's not just that he's physically repulsive, it's that there's something more than that. He's metaphysically repulsive. He's so
Because he's
eldritch
unknown.
or unnatural that people can't look at him, and it ties into contemporary beliefs in things like physiognomy, and that you could tell that people's characters and their souls or whatever maybe were expressed through their physical appearance. So, and of course, in his case, there's a mismatch because he's got actually potentially a gentle soul, but he's so repulsive that actually people physically cannot look at him. So everyone who doesn't know him is immediately repulsed by him, including Frankenstein at the beginning. The only people who literally don't immediately recoil and can't deal with him at all are the blind man and Walton, because Walton has heard all about his terrible story before he actually meets him. But even Walton can't look at him properly. So you physically can't look at him, apparently. That's how awful he is, which is quite a incredible kind of body horror, I guess. I don't know, that kind of theme,
What could that be like?
Well, yes, so it's hard to imagine, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's hard to portray in film. I mean, obviously the film version, I think the James Whale version is probably based on stage plays because that's how it originally got better known. It was much more famous as a stage play than it was as a novel in the early years. And so that was how it was culturally transmitted, and that's probably how it came to be its film version, and so far from the book. So, I mean, the Boris Karloff character, there's a thing I've got a picture in my book of what supposedly might have been the inspiration for it, which was a weird kind of robot which had been built around the time that they were doing the movie. I don't know if you can see, that's very small. This is Westinghouse's rudimentary robot Televox.
It's got
Which,
the
as you
big
can
shoulders.
see, has got a square head, basically. I mean, it's just a mannequin, compared, connected to a computer. But there's a suggestion that maybe the film designers saw that. So that's a long way from the movie, and that's to do with the theatrical productions, I think. Yeah.
So, what was you selected a passage to maybe share with us? Does that connect with these themes, these ideas?
Yes, it does, because I was just quite interested in the idea of isolation and how ironic it almost is that Frankenstein creates another being, and from that moment both of them are condemned to loneliness. They can't be within a community for different reasons. Frankenstein, because he's created this monstrous thing that he just needs to, he almost can't face his family or can't live within community because of this horror that he's created. And then the monster can't live with anybody because he's rejected, so he's in exile as well. And it just struck me when I was reading that there were two passages that kind of mirrored their loneliness and these moments where they were in agony because of their loneliness. And so would you like me to
I reckon.
read some of that? Okay. Well, the first one is after the monster is telling Frankenstein that he's just been rejected by the cottagers, so now his chance to be integrated into society, I guess, or family, is gone. Cursed creator, why did I live? Why in that instant did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly bestowed? I know not. Despair had not yet taken possession of me. My feelings were those of rage and revenge. I could with pleasure have destroyed the cottage and its inhabitants and have glutted myself with their shrieks and misery. When night came, I quitted my retreat and wandered in the wood, and now, no longer restrained by the fear of discovery, I gave vent to my anguish in fearful howlings. I was like a wild beast that had broken the toils, destroying the objects that obstructed me, and ranging through the wood with a stag-like swiftness. Oh, what a miserable night I passed. The cold stars shone in mockery, and the bare trees waved their branches above me. Now and then the sweet voice of a bird burst forth amidst the universal stillness. All save I were at rest or in enjoyment. I, like the arch-fiend, bore a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. But this was a luxury of sensation that could not endure. I became fatigued with excess of bodily exertion and sank on the damp grass in the sick impotence of despair. There was none among the myriads of men that existed who would pity or assist me, and should I feel kindness towards my enemies? No, from that moment I declared everlasting war against the species, and more than all, against him who had formed me and sent me forth to this insupportable misery. So that's him realising that he's never gonna...
There's that word misery again.
There was twice in just that passage.
I mean, he's very Byronic, isn't he?
Yeah.
Raging through the
Dramatic.
woods. Yeah,
Well, and then Frankenstein does a sort of similar thing. I don't know if you want to hear me reading it again, but sorry. This is just at the end of the next chapter, and it struck me that there was a real symmetry about these two circumstances that they find themselves in. Again in the night, again in nature, in the woods, and again this feeling of isolation. I'm just wondering if I can make this a little bit shorter, but I might skip a few bits. His tail had occupied so this is Frankenstein. His tail had occupied the whole day. Frankenstein is now scarpered, and the sun was upon the verge of the horizon when he departed. I knew that I ought to hasten my descent towards the valley, as I should soon be encompassed in darkness, but my heart was heavy and my steps slow. The labour of winding among the little paths of the mountain and fixing my feet firmly as I advanced perplexed me, occupied as I was by the emotions which the occurrences of the day had produced. The stars shone at intervals as the clouds passed from over them. The dark pines rose before me, and every here and there a broken tree lay on the ground. It was a scene of wonderful solemnity and stirred strange thoughts within me. I wept bitterly, and clasping my hands in agony, I exclaimed, "O stars and clouds and wind, ye are all about to mock me. If you really pity me, crush sensation and memory, let me become as naught, but if not, depart, depart, and leave me in darkness." Then he goes to Chamonix. Morning dawned before I arrived at the village of Chamonix. I took no rest, but returned immediately to Geneva. Even in my own heart, I could give no expression to my sensations. They weighed on me with a mountain's weight, and their excess destroyed my agony beneath them. Sorry, I've just got a few more sentences.
Theresa Maying it.
The Brexit analogies just keep going. Then I returned home, and entering the house, presented myself to the family. My haggard and wild appearance awoke intense alarm, but I answered no questions. Scarcely did I speak. I felt as if I were placed under a ban, as if I had no right to claim their sympathies, as if never more might I enjoy companionship with them. And so that is his moment.
And it might have been better if he hadn't enjoyed companionship with them, because of course, you know, he dooms
Why does he
them.
go, yeah.
Yeah, well, again, he's another wild Byronic sort of character. There's a lot of
storming,
romantic
storming in the
feeling, isn't there?
woods.
Sturm and Drang, isn't there?
Yeah.
The book is, it's something romantic, it's something gothic, but it's also one of the first, it's a horror story, but it's also one of the first sci-fi novels, or perhaps the first sci-fi novel. And I guess that's because you couldn't really have a sci-fi novel before that moment.
Well, there's a lot of debate about the first sci-fi novel. I mean, there's a strong argument. There's a book by Kepler called Somnium, about where he has a dream about going to the moon, and it's got some science in it. So some people say it's a science fiction novel. I think this has got a strong case to be. Well, certainly it is definitely a science fiction novel. I mean, not everyone would agree with that, but I certainly would say so. But I don't know if it's the first one or not. But what I think is. Because you were asking earlier, why is it so great? You know, because we're dissing it a bit. Why I think it's so great is because of this aspect of it. Because it's the way it explores basically thought experiments. It sets up a lot of thought experiments.
Because people thought
it explores them.
People thought this could happen, or this was about to happen.
Yeah.
That people were going to be able to reanimate corpses.
That's right. Yeah.
In the coming weeks or
obviously
months or whatever.
A lot of what my book is about is the context in which it was written. It was that a few decades earlier, Galvani had been stimulating his frog's legs, and so his nephew had then taken up his technology and was touring around and was using it in a kind of. There was quite a lot of theatricality then about electrical science. A lot of the demonstrations were almost like theatre, and they were done in places like rooms above pubs and stuff like that.
Were they done on dead human
So
remains?
yeah, so then they started. I can read you a bit in a minute. I mean, so when they first, so obviously Galvani started with frogs, and then some other people started experimenting with chopped up bits of ox. So I've got a good quote in my book about someone who'd been experimenting on an ox body, and they'd connected a battery to the diaphragm of the ox, and it had contracted with such violent force that it blasted feces out of its back end,
Oh,
which
God.
was quite a nice shot. So then obviously, you know, if you can do it with large mammals, why not do it with humans? So then Galvani's nephew was touring around doing his galvanic reanimation on corpses with some dramatic results. They'd used like freshly executed corpses and with some quite famous results. And so Shelley probably would have been aware of that. The bit I want to read to you is actually about an experiment which happened just after the book was published. It was in 1818. And I think it's particularly interesting because I don't know, it's possible that the guy that carried it out, a Scottish chemist called Andrew Ure, he may have known about the novel. And in a way, it certainly talks back to the publication of the novel, because this is in the wake of Frankenstein. So, and it's really gory, great stuff. So I was going to read to you from my book. It's a bit called A Gothic Experiment. And I start off asking, could the line of transmission between galvanic revivification experiments and Shelley's Frankenstein have run both ways? In 1818, the very year of the novel's publication, Scottish chemist Andrew Ure attempted a demonstration more ambitious than any staged by Aldini. Aldini was Galvani's nephew, who'd been doing some horrible experiments with corpses. So Ure theorised that previous efforts had been hampered by underpowered voltaic piles. Voltaic piles were the kind of early batteries. And he thought also that because shocks had been administered to the mass of muscle tissue rather than to the nerves that were innervating the muscles, and he was determined to prove, at least in principle, that galvanic revivification was viable. A dead body could be given life. So his demonstration took place in November in the Anatomical Dissection Theatre at the University of Glasgow. The corpse of an athletic young murderer named Clydesdale was brought to the theatre about 10 minutes after he was cut down.
Oh my God.
Ure details in his account of the experiments. 5 minutes before this, Ure had charged with nitric and sulfuric acid a powerful battery consisting of 270 pairs of 4-inch plates connected to pointed metallic rods with insulating handles for more commodious application of the electric power. Incisions were made into the body to expose nerves at the neck, hip and heels, and these were then shocked with the rods with remarkable results. Applying the rods to the heel, the corpse straightened its bent leg with such force as to send one of the assistants flying. When the sciatic nerve was stimulated, every muscle of the body was immediately agitated with convulsive movements, resembling a violent shuddering from the cold. With the rods applied to a cut in the tip of the forefinger, the fist being previously clenched, that finger extended instantly, and from the convulsive agitation of the arm, he seemed to point to the different spectators, some of whom thought he had come to life. The demonstration grew more macabre still. On stimulating Clydesdale's forehead, every muscle in his countenance was simultaneously thrown into fearful action. Rage, horror, despair, anguish, and ghastly smiles united their hideous expression in the murderer's face, surpassing far the wildest representations of a fusilier or a keen. At this period, several of the spectators were forced to leave the apartment from terror or sickness, and one gentleman fainted. But the result that excited Ure the most came when he passed electricity through Clydesdale's diaphragm. The success of it was truly wonderful. Full, nay, laborious breathing instantly commenced. The chest heaved and fell. Ure was convinced that if the body had not been that of a hanged man who had suffered severe bodily injury and been drained of blood, he could have restored life to the corpse.
Ooh.
There's always an excuse, isn't there?
So, and it's worth saying that at one of Aldini's, Galvani's nephew's demonstrations, where he galvanically revivified a corpse, apparently it was so shocking that a beadle, a law enforcement official who was present, died of fright.
Died of fright?
Yeah, supposedly.
I think if I saw that, I would die of fright. It sounds absolutely horrific.
It's good stuff.
Is it the case that the things that we now reanimate recently dead people with, I've forgotten the word for them, you know, the sort of...
So defibrillators.
Defibrillators,
well, that's
exactly.
Very interesting because, again, that was a very hot topic at the time. There was a lot of research into revivification and also into life-saving because this is a time when a lot of people were moving to London. Conditions were very horrible. There was lots of people there. A lot of people were like horribly suicidally depressed, and people were constantly throwing themselves in the river. And it's particularly grimly resonant for Mary Shelley because, of course, her mother had done exactly that.
Yes.
And her mother had been fished out. Her mother had been in a tumult of despair and had thrown herself into the Thames and had been fished out and brought back to life. And
She wasn't happy about it, was she?
Yeah, and much to her despair.
I have the quote. She said afterwards, "I have only to lament that, when the bitterness of death was past, I was inhumanely brought back to life and misery."
This is why she wrote the book.
There you go. So she that was obviously quite personally important to her. As we've heard, people close to her had been drowning left, right, and centre. And at the time, there was a lot of excitement about the possibility of using voltaic piles and electricity. That might be the vital spark of life, and that you could use that to bring people back to life. And then there was some quite interesting things I talk about in the book, experiments that had happened in the years prior to that, in the 100 years or so prior to that, where people had claimed to have done that. They'd done things like, one guy had shocked a hen to death with a battery and then supposedly brought it back to life with the same battery. Lavoisier had put one electrode down an insensible duck. I don't know why it was insensible, but he knocked it out somehow. He put one electrode down its throat and the other up its rectum, up its anus, and given it a shock and brought it back to life. So there was a lot of belief in that. Anyway,
wasn't it the case that the definition of death was slightly different then? So perhaps
that was what they were exploring at the time. Right. That was a very big concern.
I read that there was you had two deaths. You had incomplete death and absolute death,
And,
So-
and obviously people were very worried about things like being buried alive and stuff. That was another big concern at the time. So there was this whole thing about what was the boundary between life and death, and could you, could you move back and forth over it? Was it porous? That, so that was obviously a big issue, a big theme, obviously, that she explores in the book. But I mean, just to answer your question about the defibrillation, there are accounts from then of people using batteries or Leyden jars, which is a kind of electricity storage device, in what sounds exactly like that, and they claim to have done exactly that, but experts today don't think they can possibly have had enough power to have done it, so they're not quite sure where these stories have come from.
But was it the same tradition of science that eventually gave rise to the defibrillator, or was it completely different?
I think so. I think, yeah, that was where it started, and that there was, in fact, a whole society in London about, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's something like the London Life Saving Society that would publish pamphlets about, like, oh, maybe we can use electricity to bring people back to life.
Maybe we should open up the conversation a bit, and if anyone wants to share their impressions of Frankenstein, no matter when they read it, or has any questions.
Well, I've got a question for the audience.
Yes, sure.
Because we're just talking about electricity and stuff. And obviously, basically, how do you think the monster was brought to life in the first place? Put your hand up if you think that the monster is brought to life with electricity. Anyone think that from the movies, from reading the book?
Why?
A bit of electricity.
Maybe,
Yeah, I mean, obviously in the movies, it's always,
But also there's a scene at the beginning where he's getting inspired by a tree being struck by
exactly.
lightning.
Yeah, exactly.
And
in the
talk,
movies there's
talk
always
about a
these-
fluid as well.
Well, in the movies, there's always these wonderful devices, and then they use some lightning, and it's electricity that brings them to life. Of course, in the book, she never says that. What she says is that that Frankenstein gathers instruments together and infuses the being with the spark of life. And the clear, I mean, it does. So he doesn't say electricity, but there's the implication is that it is electrical. Yeah.
She kind of skates over that part.
Well, and I think that's
good
important.
reason.
She does it for a good reason, yeah. I
What's
mean,
the
I think a lot of
technique?
science fiction authors will recognise that if you tie yourself down too much, then you make yourself ridiculous because it's obviously patently, bogus. So it's much better to leave it constructively ambiguous because then you've got license to do it. Yeah. Anyway, I thought that maybe people would have thoughts about how the monster was brought to life.
Any other kinds of thoughts? No, we can carry on just chatting then, I suppose.
I mean, it seems to me that she's quite down on science. What is your take on?
Well, I think people say this, don't they? That it's a satire on science, and certainly on male scientists and their sort of hubristic and over masculine kind of attempts to control nature and have dominance over nature and stuff. I mean, I think she was. We know that she was fascinated by science, and she was exposed to it. Her father had all these people come to the house, and she would go to things like Humphrey Davy's lectures, and that she and Shelley did things like exploring simple electrical devices and the hot air balloon. She made him a hot air balloon on his birthday once. So I think she made him a hot air balloon. Yeah.
That's quite impressive.
Yeah. Well, I think it was maybe a small amount of paper. But,
Oh, right.
What's that amazing idea of the kind of solo stuff, just being able to do science yourself, just being able to do it at home.
Yeah.
Well, see,
or
that's
do
the
it as a
one.
kind of
There's a
hobby
wonderful
and
time in
and
science,
sort of
I think, when it was a lot more.
you can discover stuff.
One person exactly could do made fairly simple experiments that would prove amazing, profound things and make breakthroughs. So I think she was super interested in science.
Yeah. Maybe not so into scientists.
Maybe not, exactly, yeah. I mean, and so then you get into the whole conversation about, well, who is the model for Frankenstein?
So Sam?
Just sort of help me. I was just thinking about the glamour of Frankenstein, because obviously there is glamour there. Looking at like Prada's collection this season.
Oh, yeah.
It's like obviously not a good-looking guy. Frankenstein's a monster. Don't know too much about Dr. Frankenstein himself, but what is it? Where does that glamour come from in this story, and how is it instantly transferable to that domain? Like, what's the appeal?
And Kate, did you see the Prada show?
I wasn't at the show, but I've seen. Yeah.
Could you describe it? Because I don't really know that much about it.
Well, Miuccia Prada has for both her men's and women's collections for autumn, winter, evoked Frankenstein, and it's very much the film version of Frankenstein. So she, I think it's Universal who own the rights to Frankenstein. So she worked with them, and there are bolts of lightning on some things, sort of references to electricity on prints, and then also just the face of Frankenstein, and I think also Bride of Frankenstein as well.
Because obviously Frankenstein's monster is not exactly chic, but
Sorry, I mean the monster.
The Bride of Frank, but
Frankenstein
Mrs.
film,
Mrs. Monster, whatever. She's pretty cool.
But then there is something in the film image of the monster that is kind of, well, what word am I going to use here?
Sexy.
I can't say that. But I guess that is the, I don't know.
Hyper-masculine.
Hyper-masculine, definitely. And the big shoes and the proportions kind of lend something
It's
to.
the Mel Brooks joke.
What's that?
In Young Frankenstein, that's the big joke. Everything's going to be in proportion.
He's got a massive schlong.
Right, yeah. Okay, I was thinking more, the shoes, but yeah. So for autumn winter, Prada is
Frankenstein's the look.
Frankenstein's hot for autumn winter.
I guess
19.
glamour's about fascination at the end of the day, isn't it? And Frankenstein is endlessly fascinating.
And that kind of play on ugly, and Prada's always been very interested in sort of ugly versus beautiful and challenging notions of what beauty is and what femininity is, and I guess the Frankenstein monster is the antithesis of femininity.
I mean, it's quite interesting because when Frankenstein builds him, he kind of builds him to be beautiful. He's supposed to be this amazing specimen.
He wants him to be
incredible
gorgeous,
physique. So he's not designed to be ugly, and it's not until he's brought to life that it's his unnaturalness. It's the fact that he's so transgressive that makes him so horrific. Because while he's on the slab, he's probably quite a beautiful creation.
He talks about how he wants him to be beautiful, doesn't he?
He does. You mentioned Young Frankenstein. Do you think, is that the best adaptation, do you reckon? Have you seen many?
I'd like the book itself. I think you're kind of running it down to something. I think it rattles along. I think it actually moves very quickly. I was interested in what you said at the start about him procrastinating, but part of that is that's what's infuriating with him the whole time. He doesn't get a gun until almost everybody's dead. And then he doesn't go to the police until everybody's dead.
Yes.
And you just go, why didn't you get a gun and go to the police when the first person died?
Yeah.
And the reason why is because you got no story if the monster's shot dead.
And he sort of it's like he doesn't want to have an awkward conversation. It's very British in that sense.
The in-story justification would be that he's ashamed, I guess. That he feels too much shame.
But he's so secretive.
He feels so ashamed that Justine goes to the gallows rather than say what he's done.
He's not a
He's
sympathetic
not imagining
character,
his guilt. He actually is guilty. He's watched a woman go to the gallows when he knew that somebody else.
Yeah.
But even in the good times, he doesn't tell his teachers that he's found the secret of life. He doesn't tell them what he's done. He's
But he's not the most sympathetic character, no.
No.
He's very dishonest.
But no, I don't want to seem like we're running Frankenstein down.
No, I was really glad to go back and read it again, but I think I was shocked by the relentless kind of unhappiness that both characters suffer.
I knew it was coming. Didn't have a copy in the house and kept meaning to get one. Didn't get it till Thursday afternoon, and thought, and was amazed by how
we quickly read it. Yeah.
Was that your first time reading it?
No, I read it like 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's got, and it's got your polar exploration stuff, and it's got he's the heroic encounters on the ice, and then on the glacier rather in the middle, but then later there's encounters on the ice. So it's got lots of drama, obviously, in it. There's a lot of Gothic drama going on.
Yeah, chases and amazing scenery. It was kind of made to be a film, wasn't it?
It really resonates. I mean, it does obviously resonate. You feel the metaphorical potential of Frankenstein's monster reading it in the original so much, and everything from artificial intelligence to genetically modified food. it just leaps out as something you want to compare with those things. And actually, I mean, you're talking about Galvanism, it really reminds me of artificial intelligence and how we all sit around thinking any minute now they're going to have a thinking computer, but they never seem to quite get there.
Yeah, I mean, well, the book speaks a lot about themes around artificial consciousness, artificial intelligence, basically, because one of the central themes, obviously, is this idea about that you can create an entirely material body, but it will have a mind. I mean, whether or not it's got a soul, obviously, is the big question. And again, it's one of the themes that makes the book so powerful, is this ambivalence. Is that why he's so horrific? Because he might not have a soul? But that's one of the things that I explore in my book, is this it's an amazing sort of thought laboratory, the book, for exploring these kind of thought experiments, particularly about consciousness and identity. That's why that was my other reading when I give it a blast.
Sure.
This is about, so I mean, there's an amazing range of thought experiments that she kind of anticipates and talks about. So if you like things like the Turing test or the Chinese room, which are thought experiments about artificial intelligence, which she anticipates in her book. But I wanted to, I've talked in a book about some slightly less well-known ones. So this is about about identity and what the monster and his existence might say about identity. So if we accept the monster does have a soul, at least in the sense of being a person with conscious experience, subjectivity, and intentionality, it still leaves open the question of where this soul comes from. The creature has a personality and a character, but whose? From where does his identity derive? The most obvious possibility is that it came with his brain, a fully formed adult brain taken from the body of a person who also had an identity. Is the monster then basically the same person as whoever donated his brain to Victor's home science project? Questions such as these highlight how the novel challenges conceptions of identity and continuity of identity, another classic theme in the philosophy of mind. One attempt to answer them came from Leibniz with a thought experiment that seems highly applicable. This is Leibniz. He said, let us suppose that some individual suddenly became the Emperor of China, but only on condition that he forgot what he had been, as if he had just been reborn. Does that not come to the same in practice or in the effects that could be registered as if he had to be annihilated and then Emperor of China created at the same instant, at the same place? If we substitute Frankenstein's monster for the Emperor of China, Leibniz's scenario is a perfect fit. Common sense, Leibniz proposes, insists that we consider the monster to be an entirely new identity with no debt to the former owner of the brain. An alternative approach is suggested by one of the oldest known thought experiments, the paradox of the ship of Theseus. This was an ancient wooden ship preserved in the city of Athens and said to have been the same vessel that bore Theseus home from his scrape with the Minotaur. When a plank rotted away, it was replaced with fresh timber, causing philosophers to ponder whether the ship remained the same. If every timber were replaced so that nothing original remained, would it still be the same ship? The 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes suggested a spin on the ship of Theseus that is relevant to Frankenstein. He imagined a second ship constructed from the discarded planks of the first. This ship would be in one sense new, but in another sense would be more authentic than the first ship, since it was made from the original materials. Victor constructed his monster from discarded body parts. If the monster were reconstructed from the parts of one individual, would he be that individual? Given that the monster is actually constructed from multiple different individuals, does he partake in any of their natures? Mary appears to argue that human tissue acts as a sort of existential palimpsest. Once dead, the tissue loses any former identity and can be recycled into an entirely new identity. But the open question remains, from where does this identity, this character, this soul arise? So there you've got two quite well-known thought experiments about, the philosophy of consciousness and identity, which Frankenstein directly speaks to, and there's a whole bunch of other ones. That's, for me, the real power of the book. There's a whole legion, there's loads of them, and it explores them. And this is the touchstone that we still use to explore a lot of these things today. So that's what makes it so powerful, I think.
I think the panel, the part of the discussion is over, but I think we should carry on this conversation with some wine, and maybe think about these thought experiments some more. But thank you very much for coming along on a Saturday night. It's been really nice having you here. Enjoy the book and the magazine, and come and chat.